first? What's on second? I don't know's on third.
That's what I want to find out.
And then I say, who's on first? What's on second? I don't know's on third.
Yeah, you know the fellow's names?
Yes.
Well, who's on first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name.
Yes.
I mean the guy playing first.
Who?
The fellow playing first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who?
The guy playing first.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first.
Look, who is on
And
first?
you got a first baseman?
Yes.
Who's playing there?
Yes.
All I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
No, wait a minute. No, wait a minute. Don't mix them up. What is on second?
Who's on second?
No, who is on first?
I don't know.
He's on third now. We're not talking about him.
How did I get on third base?
You just mentioned his name.
If I mentioned the third baseman's name, who did I say is playing third?
No, who's playing first?
Never mind first. I don't know. What's the guy's name on third base?
What's on second?
Who's on second?
Who's on first?
I don't know.
Third base.
Have you got a third baseman?
Certainly.
Then who's playing third?
Who is playing first?
What's playing first?
No, what's on second?
So then we have item number 4, differences between superintendent's proposed budget and board's budget request. Who put this one on the agenda?
I think at the time there was a great deal of community questions about what was getting cut, what did that mean, and the good thing is we actually have a list here, and so maybe you gave us a piece of paper. Could somebody walk through this?
So the question was, on the agenda, the differences between the superintendent's proposed budget and the board's budget request. We've outlined in a very succinct set of bullet points where we currently are with the operating budget at the top, where the request is $906 million, and delineated down below where those are broken out. Above maintenance of effort, the additional request for county funding for 11.4 for one-time costs for needs for FY 2019. And then also the board made a decision to request $50 million, an additional $50 million to address the health care deficit during the 2017 fiscal year, 2018 fiscal year, things of which we'll be having more detailed conversations with this body as we come forward to discuss that. The main thing, the difference is that the difference between the superintendent's recommended budget and the board's budget request is that the board approved $19.2 million in reductions to the superintendent's recommended budget to fully fund the contributions to the health care costs. In total, the Board of Education request is $62 million over MOE, and I don't want to gloss over that $19.2 million cut. As we come forward to you, we are saying now with very strong authority, this is the first time in many years where health care is being fully funded in the school system budget to the percentage of which required. The budget deficit will grow this year, in this fiscal year, to $50 million at the end of this, and none of us are happy about that. The other prong of this is, with the support of the council, with your president, Mary Kay Siggety, with our board chair, Cindy Valancourt, with our county executive, and myself, we met recently with the representatives from MSDE to use one-time monies to be able to offset the $50 million that rests, what we defined, as Ms. Valancourt says, on our credit card. We are still having to pay that off. That's why I've included the additional $50 million. If we can take care of that in 1 year, that would be fantastic. But understand there were some heavy cuts. I'm going to use the word draconian, save that for only certain presentations. But understand that the list below are the very emotional, painful conversations that this board engaged with in 7 work sessions. They will speak for themselves and tell you how painful that was. But understand when our budget is 85% of our budget is personnel, of that total amount, we try to preserve with all integrity of our classrooms, but the board, with deliberation, increased class size by 1, which is a total savings of $5.6 million. And you can go down through and see all of those delineated to the 19.2. But all of that action was done to put us on the road to financial solvency, because the healthcare deficit, and let me say publicly in front of this body, has not been tended to at the level of which our county taxpayers deserve. And I'm stating as the interim superintendent, soon to be permanent superintendent with this body here of board members, if we act in the same ways that others have in the past, we're just as guilty of kicking this can down the road further. So the body, the board, myself made recommendations to make certain that our health care was completely under control with paying in terms of programs, and then also have prioritized this in a way, if the council should grant, based upon the request of the dollars at which we've had, monies to assist us, the priority would be for us to address class size and put those back in during the longer protracted process of the budget discussion. So this is a appetizer to the larger conversation that's going to occur with this body.
Can you, well, I had a question before this, but now that you've said if there was money, what was the last phrase you said in terms of if there was money that,
Well,
because we can't give any money that you haven't asked for.
and we have requested above maintenance of effort to the tune of $50 million.
Well, that's what I'm curious about. It says you're asking for $50 million over maintenance of effort, but then you also say it's a multi-year plan.
Yep.
That you're asking for it over multiple years. So how much are you asking for this year?
So, Rafi, if you would
All of it.
come up,
You're asking
we've
for
asked for
all of it?
all of it in 1 year,
And you can carve.
and you can carve, exactly.
And in your original budget, Dr. Martirano, you didn't ask for any of it.
So the original budget request is we asked for approximately $10 million over maintenance of effort, and then the request for one-time monies. As the process continued, the level of concern increased, knowing that the deficit was going to be added to. But keep in mind, and I said this publicly on, and I don't want to repeat, but I will for the sake of this body, is that if I strictly put my business hat on, I would have used all monies to address the financial deficit. But we're not a traditional business. I put monies as aside for our negotiations to the tune of $8.1 million that's still in motion to take care of our people who take care of our children. I've also added the programmatic monies to take care of our children and our people who take care of that. And then we carved out a third of that to address the health care deficit. Through the conversations, the board directed further cuts to address the health care so we wouldn't add to it in future years. But that $50 million remains on the credit card, and I think that's a wonderful way to explain it. And we're going back with the request of the dollars to assist to cover that in 1 year. If that doesn't happen, we have a multi-year plan to address it as well. So I've got several safety valves within this. Rafiu, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think you've eloquently stated it. So the $50 million, if the county has the money to give us, that would be great. But we equally know that the dollars is finite everywhere. So we came up with a plan that if the county can afford to give us the entire $50 million now to pay off the credit card, we will take whatever that they can afford to begin to pay that off.
I guess I'm unclear because at some points I hear that you have a plan, and then at some points I hear we'll take whatever. Do you have a plan, and if so, what's the plan? What do you need this year to move it forward? Are we going to try to do it in 5 years? We need 10, 10, 10. Or what's the? Help us understand.
Well, I think that, my attempt working with our board is that I'm asking for it in 1 year.
Right.
In an ideal world, I'm asking to get us out of this financial matter in 1 year. I'm also being very prudent in the dollars that are available in the county. I'm asking the superintendent, and many of us did not create this problem. I'd like to get out of it in 1 year so that we could use the additional requests in future years to address the programmatic needs and compensation. So I've asked for that. The board has adopted that in their budget.
Well, see, that's what I guess that's where I'm trying to understand. So you asked for that, and the board adopted that. But I guess what I'm seeing here is that you didn't ask for that, and then the board had to make cuts. That's where I guess I'm unclear.
There's a lot of moving pieces.
Okay.
Yeah, help us on. I guess I'm trying to understand the difference between what Dr. Martirano requested, what you did, and then these cuts that were the intervening things.
So the thing is that we want to be putting 85% of our share into the health fund, right? So the $50 million deficit represents fiscal year 17 and what we assume will be fiscal year 18. The 19 addresses the fiscal year 19 as well, what the assumed debt would be if we did not fully fund the 85% of the premiums that we are supposed, and care and healthcare costs that we are supposed to fund under the negotiated agreements. The employees typically are 15% payer, and we're the 85%. And the 85% has not always been going into the health fund. So what Dr. Martirano gave us was a budget that still had a shortfall of $19 million and asked us to try and suggested ways to try to address that. So because if we didn't do all of that, we would have a grand total at the end of fiscal year 19 of $69 million of a deficit. So the 19 is what we tried to do to prevent 19 from being a further bleeding. Does that make sense?
And I think you just also helped address, there was two things I was going to point out that, before when you were talking about just funding 85%, the other 15% was coming from what was being paid in, which just for the public, I know we all know that, but as we were talking about it, I wouldn't want to make
employees,
people to think that it was only
In
85%
general.
being funded. It's going to be 100% funded.
Right.
It's just 15% coming from employee contributions.
Correct. And the
So
85%
we're all
has
talking
not
like
been
we
funded.
know that, but because we know that and everybody else does. And then the other thing, just real quick on a clarification, was that not all that 19.2 is reductions. It should really be just some savings, but I was talking about there's additional revenue. So there's also additional fund sources. So it's really total reductions and additional fund sources to come up with that 19.2.
But only
Yes.
one.
Right, but so just from a labeling perspective, there's two that are in there that have to do with revenue. And so just to be clear for everybody, that's not all cuts there. True.
Correct.
So that amount being requested is in fixed charges? Is that where?
The 50?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if it's in fixed charges, just to clarify, you're not expecting any of these things to be restored or some of these in fixed charges because we can't restore them somewhere else, is my understanding.
Well, it's a deficit that's part of the entire school system's budget. So,
But it has to be in a category, right?
yes, it's category 12.
So I guess my point is that we can only restore it by category. So if you're not asking for it, unless I'm misunderstanding something, my understanding is we can only restore it in a category that you've asked for it in. So I just want folks to understand that by the time it gets to us and to the executive, it's done. So if you're not asking for a restoration of any of these things, then that can't happen. Is that?
I know because we've asked for, we can move the categories around if we want to, but because the dollar we've asked for the entire budget, so you can move whatever you want from one category to
No,
another.
the council cannot do that, sir.
I think and this is the strategy was if you were to get additional funds or some whatever proportion from the county to pay the deficit, that then you can apply that to the deficit, then freeing up some additional funds that you might have that were going to pay down the deficit from your perspective, and then assign those to other categories.
Yeah, that's one.
Right,
Yes,
that's-
that's a possibility.
But how
Yes.
does that work?
Yeah,
No, that's not a legally permissible action from what we've been told.
That's why I was trying to understand the strategy versus the
I
execution.
think that, right. I think that the confusion here is partially because we are looking at the Board of Ed's request. We don't yet know and won't know until the 20-something of April what the county executive's going to move forward. I think we all remember very clearly that if he fully funds a category, we cannot add to it. If, right. And so we'll have to wait and see how he funds the budget to determine what actions we might have available to us. So that'll be, again, a conversation, a more detailed conversation about
Right.
what we may be able to do when we get to discussing the budget.
Right, and I know you're more familiar with these budgets than I am, but my understanding is that the executive as well can only restore up to what they've asked for in a category.
Can only give up to
They
what
can
they've
only
asked
give,
for.
right, and we
Yes.
can only restore up to that. So again, if they have not asked for this money in a category where they need it, you're out of luck.
We asked for $50 million more than next
So,
year.
so I guess
My-
here's where I guess
It's not fundable?
the community often hears, well, the board made these tough cuts, but if the county council can restore it, then you'll get your, world-class language. We won't increase class size, X, Y, and Z, and that is not the case. The case is if you didn't ask for it, we cannot now restore it.
Right, and so it's not fungible, that's what I was saying
I know,
here.
you keep telling me that, and I
Right.
keep being told something different.
Right, and, well,
So
that's why I'm
that's
hoping to
what
get
we
some
need
clarity,
to-
yes, I agree.
Yeah.
So refuse, like, a refuse, you're saying that they asked for 50 million over, but it's not 50 million in the budget, it's $50 million in a category.
No, it's in the budget.
We did ask for it in categories.
Overall, you can't just shift things around. It's in particular categories.
Yes, but we equally have another process that comes to this council where we do categorical transfers.
So what you're saying is that we put
So,
tens of millions of dollars in one category, and then months later, you come to a council and ask for a transfer out of that category into,
They're just saying.
as opposed to just asking for it now.
That's the strategy I'm hearing. And
Okay,
that's
and
what I
then
was
we would have to give you
confirming that, in
extra
fact,
money,
that's.
more money than we expected to give
we
you
can-
in the category.
No, it would have to, so, Mr. Glenn, I'm sorry. I
Right.
was going to say, if Mr. Glendening can say what he said out loud and.
Yes, if he can say it with
Into a mic.
with a microphone, yes.
I'm sorry, yeah, but I don't believe, but maybe the attorney over there solicitor could say, chime in, but I don't. I know he loves to come sit at the table, but I don't believe that can happen at budget time. That would have to come later down the road.
Absolutely.
And it would
And that's
require us
what
to put
that's what
extra
I'm
money.
hearing right now is the plan.
It
We
would,
do need that money.
so,
Right, but it would require us to put it in a category where you weren't anticipating it going, where we weren't agreeing. It would require us all to sort of collude that it would at some point go into another category, not the one
Mr.
that
Cook
you're-
is going to join us at this time.
right.
To shed some
So
think it's
increase,
light on
so
this.
you're increasing class sizes, that costs $5.6 million. In order for your plan to work, we have to overfund a category now by $5.6 million on purpose, that was available. And then months later, you would have to then come back to us and ask us to transfer out of that category to another. Why not just ask for the money?
well, we equally know that the board has the ability to amend its request if the money has been promised to be given to us. No,
Wait a
no,
minute,
no.
not
And we've
after
done,
the-
we've done so before
During
in
the
the past.
budget process.
Okay,
Yes, through the
but-
budget process.
But my understanding, maybe the Office of Law can weigh in here, is not after the county executive's budget comes out.
If we know we're getting the funding, yes, we can amend it, but we don't have any.
No.
I'll let the solicitor speak.
Yeah, if the executive agrees, but what I'm saying is why not just ask for it now? Why ask for less and then hope for more, and then once you get more, say, we really wanted more? That doesn't make sense.
so,
Mr. Cook
so
has joined
Dr.
us.
Ball, they made their decision, they sent in their budget, right? And so now we're with Mr. Cook sitting here to remind us what our abilities are.
Yes.
Okay?
Good.
And if,
Because the public needs to understand when people are
it's-
going around and saying, well, if the council can restore, that's just not legally able to happen
Correct.
unless Mr. Cook advises us
Dr.
otherwise.
Ball, yes.
So state law sets the budget categories for the Board of Education. And state law gives the Board of Education the sole power to determine how much money they want to budget in all of those categories. So the step before that is when the superintendent brings his proposal to them. But ultimately, the board decides how much it wants to ask for in those categories within state law. It comes to the executive, and the executive decides whether those categories will be funded in whole or in part based on the maximum ask of the board. Once the budget bill comes down, all those operating decisions have been made, both between what the board has asked for in its budget and what the county needs to fund its own budget. State law is very clear about what the executive may do and what the council may do. The executive has the discretion to not fully fund each budget category, which again are set by state law, and the council only has the power to restore cuts made by the executive from the board's request to the county
Can you
in those categories.
And so can you clarify what you meant by the total ask?
In categories. So, for example, you have a category for teacher salaries, right? You ask for 100. The executive says, "I'm going to fund it at 90." The council may increase it back to 100, but that's all the council can do.
So let's pretend we asked for $50 million more in the fixed charges category than fiscal 19's projected expense. The county executive can fund up to that extra $50 million.
In fixed charges.
Right.
That's the problem.
That's right.
But
Right, and-
we can't restore class sizes, or we can't do any of those things that people are asking us to do. Those are completely within your ability to ask for, but not within our ability.
So
And
the
then
point,
there can be a second step unless we've been
the point, the point is that the state has told the board the categories in which it can allocate money, right? And once the board has chosen as a matter of policy to fund a category at X, the county's choices are to reduce that X or put it back. The reduction is within the discretion of the executive, and the put back is within the discretion of the council. It's all we can do.
Dr. Ball, not Dr. Ball, Mr. Fox.
So for example, yeah, it has happened a lot this year.
Brother from another.
You know, us guys, we're all the same, right? So, going to the page that we got here that summarizes, the request is, for example, the superintendent's budget for instruction had asked for $364 million, almost 365, yet the board requested almost $8 million less, which gets into the cause of the class size issue. So, that's not something that we can't even restore back to what the superintendent did based off of the fact that the board actually cut what the superintendent had recommended, which actually ended up impacting class size. And the whole thing would just be us hoping, before they even do it, because the class size thing is something that happens at the beginning of the year for the most part, that they're going to somehow be able to fix that, knowing, that they got $8 million more in fixed charges, which their whole reason for doing it was actually to pay down the other stuff, not to put it into class sizes. So, it just, a lot of that just doesn't end up making sense. We're put in a position that, as Dr. Ball said, I agree 100% with my colleagues across from me on this. The way the board ended up doing it really ends up tying our hands. I mean, the way the superintendent's was actually gave us a lot more flexibility within the numbers that were there that had to do with instruction and everything else, versus laying it all on this gamble of the fixed charge shell game that's not really a transparent public process that the county and the citizens should expect.
Mr. Blum, you've come up to the table.
Thank you for recognizing me. I wanted to reference another funding alternative or process here, which hasn't been discussed, which is that the county council would provide lump sum funding to the Board of Education, which this county council has often done over the years, as you all know, being on both sides, leaving it to the Board of Education to then determine the categories.
So this will be my 13th or 14th budget. What is this often? I don't recall us doing that.
I go back to 2000, and I know that it's occurred. But anyway, it's legally permissible for the county council and any county council under state law. You can provide lump sum funding, or you can exercise what's called a categorical control.
Even if the executive does a categorical
It's up to the county
distribution?
council.
So we can disregard the executive's
Right.
And when you restore, you can provide lump sum funding.
Mr. Weinstein, if we might. I think this came up in the last couple of years when the county executive chose to fund by category, as opposed to in previous years before you were on the council with us, where the categories were articulated in the budget, but they were not funded specifically by the county executive. So that goes to what Mr. Blum is talking about, giving the board flexibility to set those categories. But in the last couple of years, they have been funded by category. And so, again, this will depend on what what our county executive chooses to do within the budget.
Mr. Blum
But-
just suggested that the council can give a lump sum.
Well, right, and I was going to go
That's not the
to
case.
Mr. Cook, because we've basically had this discussion before in relation to what power did we have. We tried last year and the year before to try to figure this out. And if I recall correctly, Mr. Cook, you told us that once the county executive funded by category, then we were stuck with what was with those categories.
Correct.
Okay.
We're not
That's
going to ask
good.
you to elaborate on that.
I could have asked him,
Was that Jim Irvin?
no, it was Dr. Cousins. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martirano.
So just to make sure that I'm clear and that we're all clear, if the county executive chooses not to fund by category this year, but gives us at least part of the $50 million request above the basic operating budget, and then we can legally, my understanding is, if it's not funded by category, we can move those funds where we need them. The other understanding I have then, I just want to make sure, is that if we asked for 50 million and we got 30 million, the county council can restore some part of that 50 million above. So if we take a look at our total budget, including the 50 million on our credit card, and we get only part of that, the county council can restore it, any part that they feel that they're able to do. Is that
Mr.
correct?
Cook.
So in this hypothetical budget, well, let's stick with this budget. When you submitted this year's request, was it broken out by categories?
Yes,
Yes.
it has
Okay,
to be. Our request is,
Then the answer is no, because you, as a board, have decided, based on the state scheme, to fund those categories at the amounts you chose. Those are your policy choices. The executive can't undo your policy choices like that. He may reduce your policy choices, so your hypothetical category of X, you asked for 50, he chooses in his discretion to fund it at half of that. But then we're back to where we started this conversation. So you've exercised the power that you have and that the state has given you. You've funded categories, you've made policy decisions. We want to put this much money in this category, this much money in the following, so on and so forth. The county executive has no power to undo the choices that you made when you voted to submit the budget that you submitted.
And if I may, I'm just going to quickly, just respectfully disagree. I think if the appropriation comes in lump sum funding, then it's at the board's final adoption. We all know we're talking proposal. It's at the board's final adoption. They could move money among categories. That's the benefit of getting lump sum funding.
I don't think
And
you're
Mr. Blum-
disagreeing. I think you
Right.
said the same thing. If
Oh.
it's lump sum, then you can, but
Okay, I'm
if it
sorry, I
comes
missed
to
that part of it then.
And I would,
lump sum
and I
coming
would
from
say
the
to you.
Because you didn't ask for
Right.
lump sum
His
funding.
decision,
Okay, ladies
not
and
ours.
gentlemen, all right, so hypothetically, I would agree with you, Mr. Blum. Those circumstances, though, if I recall correctly, having sat on the Board of Education, were the result of not full funding, and therefore being able to move within categories by the board in order to accommodate, how are you going to accommodate the funding that you got, which wasn't what you fully asked for, right? So that's the freedom that exists in that has existed in some previous budgets, but hasn't existed in the last
Right.
2-3 years. But because it's hypothetical, all right, and because it is trending later and later, and we've lost the superintendent. And Sandy. And Mrs. French, I watched her walk out as well. And because we are going to have lots of opportunity to talk about this topic further when we actually have a concrete budget in front of us, I'm going to suggest that, we have now the chance to think about it, and we will be paying attention to the capital budget for the next 3 weeks, and then we'll get the operating budget at that point in time, where the conversation will become very real, because we'll know what the county executive has chosen to do.